The gate at Harmon Ranch had a particular sound when it swung open. Not loud, not ceremonial. Just the low complaint of iron that had been hanging in the same post for 20 years, doing its job without being asked to do it quietly. Rye Calloway heard that sound behind him as he walked his horse through, and he did not look back at it, because a man who looks back at a gate he has just come through is a man who is already thinking about leaving. He was not thinking about leaving. He was thinking about the man on the porch. Gideon Harmon was 53 years old and built the way Wyoming builds men who stay broad through the shoulders, gray at the temples, in the way that reads as earned rather than aged, with a face that had long since stopped making expressions it did not mean. He was sitting in a straight-backed chair with a rifle resting across his knees. Not raised, not aimed, just there the way a man keeps a hand near something that belongs to him, something he has used before and will use again if the occasion requires it. Rye pulled his horse to a stop 10 yards from the porch steps and stayed in the saddle. He kept his eyes on Gideon Harmon's face and not on the rifle, because looking at the rifle would mean one of two things, and neither of them served him. The morning was cold. Late October in the Wind River Range had a quality to it that other cold did not. Not the wet cold of the eastern states, not the dry cold of the high desert, but something with weight to it. Something that pressed against a man's coat and found the places where the stitching had worn thin. It was the kind of cold that asked a man what he was made of, not aggressively, but with the patient certainty of something that had been asking that question for a long time and intended to keep asking it. Gideon Harmon did not speak. Rye Calloway did. "I came for your daughter, sir." Not a request, not an apology. Just the fact of it stated plainly the way Rye stated most things, because he had learned early that the men worth impressing were never impressed by a man who dressed his intentions up in language meant to soften them. Gideon looked at him for a long time. The look of a man assessing something he might buy, thorough patient holding his conclusions until he had enough evidence to trust them. He looked at Rye's horse, at the worn saddle, at the boots that had been resoled twice and were asking for a third time. He looked at the coat that was good canvas, but not new canvas. He looked at Rye's hands on the reins, the hands of a man who worked for a living, calloused and capable with the particular stillness of hands that know what they are for. Then he looked back at Rye's face. "Then you'd better be worth more than you look." It was not a welcome. It was not a dismissal. It was something in between the opening position of a man who intended to find out whether the person sitting on that horse deserved to be there, and who had no particular interest in making the process comfortable for anyone. Rye nodded once. "Yes, sir, that's what I intend to show you." He did not ask permission to dismount. He did not ask where to put his horse. He read the yard the way he read most things, by looking at what was there and understanding what it meant, and he tied his horse at the post near the water trough and stood with his hat in both hands and waited. Because the next words belonged to the older man. It had started 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday in late September, with a fence. The boundary line between Harmon Ranch and the Kellerman spread ran for 40 yards along the eastern edge of both properties, and the flooding that spring had pulled 12 of those yards out of the ground posts, leaning wire-slack cattle from both sides pressing at the gap with the patient interest that cattle always showed when a boundary disappeared. Old Kellerman had sent Rye out with wire and tools and the expectation that whoever managed the Harmon land would handle their half. Nobody came from the Harmon side. Rye fixed the whole line anyway. Both sides, post-to-post wire, pulled tight, and even staples driven clean. He did it because leaving a job half-finished sat wrong with him in a way he had never been able to explain to anyone's satisfaction, including his own. It was not about credit. It was not about being seen. It was about the fact that a fence was either sound or it was not. And a fence that was not sound caused problems for everyone on both sides of it, and Rye Calloway did not see the logic in creating problems he had the tools to prevent. He was pulling the last wire taut when he heard boots in the dry grass. She came from the direction of the tree line. Unhurried, direct covering ground the way people do when they have walked the same land so many times their feet know the way without asking permission from their eyes. She was 19 years old. dark-haired, serious-faced, with the kind of eyes that took in everything at once and filed it accurately. She was a large woman, solidly, substantially built, the kind of woman whose body announced itself without apology, who moved through space like she had every right to it, which she did. She wore a working coat and working boots, and there was nothing about her that suggested she had dressed for anyone's opinion of her. Rye noticed all of this. Then he returned his eyes to the fence because he had not been raised to stare. "You're not our man," she said. "No, ma'am. Rye Calloway. I'm Kellerman's." She walked the fence line with her eyes, all of it, both sides. The whole repaired length the way a person looks at work when they know what good work costs and what poor work costs more. "Our man didn't come." "No, ma'am." "You fixed our side anyway." Seemed right. She was quiet. Not the quiet of someone with nothing to say. The quiet of someone who thinks before speaking, which told him more about her in 4 seconds than most people revealed in an hour. "That's unusual out here," she said. "Doing what's right when nobody's watching and nobody's paying." Rye pulled off his gloves and looked at her directly, briefly, because she had said something that deserved a direct look. Somebody's always watching, even if it's only yourself. Something moved in her expression. Something small, and considering the way a calculation moves through a mind that works quickly and does not announce its process. "Bess Harmon," she said, "this is my father's land." "I know it. Everyone in the county knows Harmon Ranch." She picked up the spare wire coil lying in the grass and set it beside his toolbox without being asked, the natural reflex of someone who worked first and thought about why later. It was a small thing. It told him everything. "Thank you for the fence, Mr. Calloway," she said. "Don't mention it, Miss Harmon." She walked back toward the tree line. Rye watched her go for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to understand he was in serious trouble, and then picked up his tools and went back to work. He thought about that conversation for 4 straight days. He came back the following Tuesday with a fence tool he had deliberately left wedged in a post on the Kellerman side because he needed it back with some urgency, and the Kellerman side was after all 20 yards from the Harmon side, and it would be efficient to check the fence line while he was there. Bess Harmon was already at the fence line, tightening a section on her side that was not broken, only loose work that could have waited a week without consequence. Work she had decided not to wait on. She looked up when she heard his horse. "Mr. Calloway." "Miss Harmon." He retrieved the tool from the post, stood there a moment longer than retrieval required. "How long have you worked this section?" She paused, considering the question the way she considered everything, like it deserved real consideration rather than a reflexive answer. "Since I was 12. My mother passed when I was 11. After that, there was work that needed doing." "I'm sorry about your mother." "Thank you." She returned to the wire. She believed a person ought to know how to do useful things. "Looks like it took." She glanced at him sideways. "Was that a compliment?" "Yes, ma'am." "From a man who fixed a fence that wasn't his assignment," she said. "I suppose I'll accept it." They worked their respective sides in silence, him on wire that did not strictly need attention, her moving with the methodical economy of someone who had never wasted emotion in her life. It was the kind of silence that required ease to sustain, the kind that goes uncomfortable fast between strangers who do not know each other well enough to share it. Rye could not remember the last time silence with someone had felt like this, not like something to fill, but like something to inhabit. He came back 5 more times. Each visit had a reason. The reasons got thinner each time. By the 5th, he was not pretending. He just showed up, tied his horse at the fence post, and worked whatever needed working, and Bess let him because she had stopped pretending too. The town of Granger noticed. That was the thing about a town of 400 people in Wyoming territory. It noticed everything, and it had opinions about everything. It noticed, and it shared those opinions in places where the person being discussed was likely to hear. The hardware store, the feed merchant, the long bench outside the post office where men sat in the thin autumn sunshine and rendered judgment on the world passing before them. Rye Calloway, the Kellerman hand with dirt on his boots and nothing in his pockets, kept riding out to Harmon Ranch, kept working the fence line, kept finding reasons to be on that property. And Bess Harmon, large, plain-spoken, serious-faced Bess Harmon, whom the young men of Granger had always found easy to overlook, kept letting him. The town had a theory. The town's theory was that it was not the girl Rye was interested in. It was the land. 40,000 acres of good Wyoming range solid water rights, a cattle operation that had been running clean for 20 years under Gideon Harmon's capable hand. A poor man with ambition and a willingness to show up regularly could do worse than to make himself useful to that particular family. The town shared this theory freely. Rye heard it twice, once at the feed merchant and once at the post office bench, and said nothing both times because the theory was wrong, and he had learned that arguing with a wrong theory only gave it more life than it deserved. Conrad Ellery arrived at Harmon Ranch on the second Thursday of October, and Rye happened to be at the fence line when the man rode through the gate. Conrad was 28 years old and carried himself with the ease of someone who had never seriously questioned whether he belonged in a room. His father, Harlan Ellery, had built the largest cattle operation in the county over 30 years of hard dealing and harder weather. Conrad had inherited the operation and the name and the particular quality of confidence that comes to men who have never had to earn their position from scratch. He rode a good horse, he wore a good coat, he smiled the way men smile when they have decided that smiling is a tool and have practiced using it until the practice no longer showed. Rye watched from the fence line as Conrad dismounted in the Harmon yard, shook Gideon's hand with the ease of someone who had done it many times before, and went inside. He watched for 30 seconds. Then he went back to work because watching a man walk into someone else's house was not his business. But an hour later, when Conrad came back out and stood talking with Gideon in the low, deliberate manner of men discussing numbers, Rye found himself working a section of fence that ran close to the yard, and he could not help what the wind carried. "A practical arrangement," Conrad was saying. "The grazing rights on your north section. Your operation could use the income, and mine could use the range. It's a straightforward transaction. The north section isn't available, Conrad." Gideon's voice was flat and final. "Same answer as last time." Men reconsider their positions. I'm not most men. Conrad let the subject go the way a man lets go of something he fully intends to pick up again later. He turned toward his horse, and as he turned, his gaze moved across the yard, across the fence, and landed on Rye for a moment. Long enough to register, long enough to assess. But before it moved on, it stopped briefly. Barely on the large framed survey map hanging on the wall inside the open front door of the house. The northeast corner of the property, the section along the eastern boundary. Rye noted where Conrad's eyes had rested. He filed it without knowing yet what to do with it. Conrad rode out of the yard, and as he passed the fence line, he pulled his horse up beside Rye with the unhurried manner of a man accustomed to commanding other people's time. "Calloway, heard you've been making yourself useful over here." "Fence work," Rye said, and kept working. "Harmon's a good man." Conrad looked out over the property with the appreciative eye of someone already calculating what it might be worth under different management. His daughter's something else. A proprietary quality in his voice, the tone of a man who has decided something falls into the category of things he wants without particularly asking whether it wants him back. A practical woman. She understands what this county runs on, what a man needs before he comes calling on a family like the Harmons. He looked at Rye pleasantly. Rye set down his pliers and looked at Conrad directly. "Being seen and being secure aren't always the same thing," he said. Conrad's smile held, but something behind it went still. "Nice way of talking," he said. "Talk doesn't buy cattle." "No," Rye agreed. "It doesn't." Conrad studied him for a moment with the measuring quality of a man who is expected to end a conversation and found it continuing without his permission. Then the smile settled back into its practiced position, and he touched his hat and rode on. Rye stood at the fence post and watched him go and thought about where Conrad's eyes had rested on that survey map. The northeast corner, the eastern boundary, the same section of fence he had been repairing all month. He thought about it longer than it probably warranted. Then he went back to work, because thinking was not the same as knowing, and he had no evidence of anything except a man who had looked at a wall for half a second. That was not nothing, but it was not enough. The first time Bess told him no, it was direct and complete, and left no room for misunderstanding. They were at the south water trough. Bess checking the float valve with the focused attention she gave every task, Rye doing nearby work that could have waited another week. She had known he was there. She had not pretended otherwise. "You've been on this property 8 times in 6 weeks, she said without looking up from the valve. 9, he said. 2 of them had legitimate reasons. She glanced up at the sideways look of a woman who has received an unexpected data point and is deciding what weight to give it. "I'm going to tell you no," she said, plainly, without cruelty but without softening. "I'm telling you that honestly so you don't misread what it means when I don't ask you to leave." "What does it mean when you don't ask me to leave?" "It means you fix good fence and you don't make a nuisance of yourself." She returned to the valve. "It doesn't mean anything else." "All right," he said. He went back to work. She went back to the valve. Neither of them mentioned it again that day. The second time she told him no came 3 weeks later, and it had a different quality, not just a boundary being stated, but a history being explained, which meant she had thought about him enough to want him to understand something. He had asked plainly and without decoration if he could come calling properly. Bess set down her ledger and looked at him across the fence rail. "No," she said. Then after a pause that lasted exactly long enough to mean something, "Men have come around before Mr. Calloway. Good men. They looked at this property, and they looked at me, and they calculated. Every one of them calculated." Her voice was not bitter. It was factual, which was its own kind of hard to hear. "I have no interest in being someone's arithmetic." "I'm not calculating," Rice said. "Every man who's ever told a woman he wasn't calculating had already run the numbers," she said. "That's the nature of it." He had no answer for that. Not one she would believe, and he understood why she would not believe it, and he respected the understanding too much to argue against it. A man could not argue a woman out of a correct assessment of the world. What he could do was be patient and show up and let his actions be the argument, because actions could not be dismissed the way words could. He came back the following Tuesday. The third time she said no was a Wednesday morning. Rye had ridden to the Harmon gate with his hat in his hand and asked plainly if he could take supper with the family that Sunday. "No," Bess said from the porch steps, arms crossed, voice even, eyes on him direct and clear. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He turned his horse, rode 40 yards toward the gate. "Next Sunday," she said behind him. He stopped, turned in the saddle. She stood on the porch steps with her arms still crossed and her expression unchanged. "My father eats at 6, she said. "Coffee black. He doesn't like his food talked over." Rye sat still on his horse for a moment, understanding that something had shifted in a direction he had not anticipated and could not have engineered, because it had come from her, which was the only direction it could have come from that would mean anything. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Don't be late," she said, and went inside. He rode back toward the Kellerman spread in the thin October sunshine, with a feeling he did not have a precise name for something between relief and the particular alertness of a man who has just understood that the test he is being asked to pass is harder than he originally thought, and finds that fact encouraging rather than otherwise. He arrived Sunday at 10 minutes before 6. Gideon was on the porch with his coffee watching the road with the patience of a man who has decided something will happen and is waiting to see in what condition it arrives. He nodded once when Rye tied his horse. Rye nodded back. Inside, Bess had set the table with a plainness that spoke of pride without performance. Everything clean, everything useful, nothing decorative for its own sake. She gave him one straight, brief, measuring look when he came through the door. "Mr. Calloway. Miss Harmon. It smells remarkable." "Sit," Gideon said. They sat. Supper moved in the manner of a meal that had a purpose beneath the eating of it. Gideon asked about the Kellerman work, about the state Rye had come from, about his father. Not prying, taking measure. Rye answered everything straight the work, Wyoming his father, who had been a laborer and died when Rye was 15. His mother, who had remarried a decent man. The fact that he and his stepfather owed each other nothing and resented each other nothing, which was its own kind of clean accounting. Gideon listened to all of it with the face of a man who has learned to spend his words carefully thorough and patient, holding his conclusions close. He set down his coffee cup near the end of the meal with the deliberateness of a man who is done with the preliminary portion of an evening. "Devil's Bench," he said. Rye had heard the name. Everyone in the county had heard it the way you hear about a place with a reputation for finishing men, not with death mostly, but with the quieter violence of weather and isolation and the accumulated weight of hard country when there is no one watching to see if you stopped. "What about it?" Rye said. "I hold a winter contract on that section," Gideon said. "High pasture, brutal terrain, good land and good water, but 22 miles from the main operation and too far for me to manage effectively with my current crew. I lose hands there every year, not to death mostly, but to quitting. Men go out and find it harder than they planned and walk off the job before February." Rye waited. "I need someone to winter there," Gideon said. 6 months. No wages the section doesn't earn against wages this year. But if you come through in spring, if the cattle come through, if the property comes through." He paused. "We'll have a conversation of a different kind." The table was completely quiet. Bess had set down her fork. Rye looked at Gideon Harmon across the table. Then he looked briefly at Bess. She was looking at the table. Her jaw was set in the way of a woman who knows exactly what Devil's Bench is, who has sat at this table before, when other men were given this same choice and watched them calculate, hesitate, find reasons why autumn was the wrong time to go to high country. She raised her eyes and met his for exactly the right amount of time. Then she looked back at her father. "When do I leave?" Rye said. Gideon poured himself more coffee, said nothing further. And the fire in the hearth burned steadily, and the evening settled around the three of them, and Rye understood in the way that men understand things that have no written language that nothing had been given, but something had begun. October in the Wind River. Range came without apology. The first frost arrived on a Wednesday morning, thin and hard, laying itself across the yard like a declaration of intent. Rye was up before dawn. He sat on the edge of his bunk in the dark, with his hands on his knees and his eyes on nothing in particular, checking his resolve the way he checked his gear, not with drama, but with the methodical attention of a man who intended to see something through and wanted to be certain he had everything he would need. Extra rope, a good knife, warm blankets in oilcloth, dried provisions enough for 3 weeks with the knowledge that supply runs would be rare and nobody would be coming to check on him if something went wrong. A journal blank unasked for purchased at the dry goods store for 35 cents because he had a feeling he would want a record of what happened out there, and a record required paper. He rode to Harmon Ranch in the pre-dawn dark and arrived as the sky was going from black to the deep blue that comes just before morning, commits to anything. Gideon was already in the yard, not waiting but working. Checking a water line that had started to freeze at the valve, crouched in the cold with a wrench and the focused attention of a man who does not allow small problems the leisure to become large ones. He looked up when he heard Drum's hooves on the frozen ground. "Calloway," he said. "Mr. Harmon." Gideon straightened and produced a folded contract from his coat. "Property boundaries. Cattle count 212 head. Expected condition at spring handoff." Rye read it all, every line slowly. Gideon watched him read without impatience. Rye signed it against his horse's saddle and handed it back. Gideon folded it into his coat without looking at it. "You have questions?" Gideon said. "One," Rye said. "Is there anything out there that's going to surprise me that you haven't told me?" Gideon looked at him for a moment. "Yes," he said. "But if I told you, it wouldn't be the test." He said it flatly, without apology, and Rye nodded because that was the only honest answer, and he recognized honesty by its texture. It did not try to make itself comfortable. "One more thing," Gideon said, and his voice dropped half a register. Not softer, more serious. You come back in spring with my cattle in acceptable condition and my property intact, we'll talk. You come back and the cattle are short, or the fencing's down, or the line shack's been neglected. He stopped. Don't come back at all. Understood, Rye said. Gideon nodded once, turned and went back to the water line. Rye remounted and turned his horse toward the north. He was 30 yards from the gate when he heard the porch door. He did not stop, did not turn around. Mr. Calloway, Bess's voice clear in the cold morning air, no waver in it, exactly as direct as everything else she had ever said to him. He stopped his horse and turned in the saddle. She stood at the edge of the porch in her heavy coat, dark hair loose around her shoulders, the way he had never seen it before. She had come out quickly before she had finished preparing for the day. She had been waiting for this moment. She had thought about it ahead of time. That told him something. She looked at him across 30 yards of frozen ground and cold morning air. Come back, she said, not a plea, not a request. An instruction delivered with the same level direct authority she used for everything, but with something underneath it that was different from her usual steadiness. Something that had cost her something to say out loud in the open air where it could not be taken back. Rye held her gaze. Yes, ma'am, he said. He turned his horse north and rode into the dark. He rode for 2 hours before he reached into his coat pocket for the contract to read the boundary descriptions one more time and found something else. A second paper, smaller, folded separately, tucked inside the contract. He unfolded it in the saddle, holding the reins in one hand, and read 4 words in handwriting that was careful and precise and wasted nothing. The stovepipe. Check it. He stared at those 4 words for a long time, riding north in the Wyoming dark, with the cold at his collar and drum moving steady beneath him. Then he put the paper in the inside pocket of his coat close to his chest and rode on. The mountains rose around him cold and indifferent against a sky going slowly from black to gray. And Devil's Bench waited 22 miles north, like something that had been waiting a long time for exactly the right kind of man to arrive. Devil's Bench did not introduce itself gradually. It arrived all at once, the moment Rye crested the northern ridge and the terrain opened before him like a man spreading his hands to show he was holding nothing kind. The trees thinned to nothing up here. The wind came down from Canada, with nothing between it and him to reduce its ambitions. The sky sat lower, as though the altitude had brought him close enough to it that it had lost whatever distance made it comfortable to look at. The line shack was sound. That was the first thing he checked, and it was the best news of the morning. Gideon's maintenance showed in the walls and the roof, both solid, both recently attended. The stove was functional. The wood supply would last 2 weeks, which meant he needed to put up more before the serious cold arrived, and the serious cold up here arrived without warning and stayed without apology. He started a fire. He unpacked his gear with the economical precision of a man who has learned that disorder in a small space costs more than it saves. Then he went out to find the cattle. 212 head. Gideon's cattle were spread across 3 sections of the high pasture, already growing their winter coats, moving with the resigned patience of animals that had wintered at elevation before and understood that patience was the only reasonable response to what was coming. Rye spent the rest of that first day riding the boundary, mapping the terrain in his head where the fencing was sound and where it wanted attention, where the natural water sources were, and which ones would freeze solid by December, where the land gave shelter from the northern exposure, and where it offered none. There was a great deal that would freeze solid by December. He came back to the line shack after dark, and ate what he had packed and sat by the stove in the silence. The silence up here was not peaceful. It was not empty. It had weight, the weight of a place that was genuinely without anything between a man and the full reality of where he was. No town sounds, no voices, no sounds of other people's lives proceeding alongside his own. Just the wind and the stove and the dark outside the single window. He took the small paper from his inside pocket. The stovepipe. Check it. He set it on the table and looked at it. Then he climbed up and ran his hand along the stovepipe junction at the second elbow, feeling in the dim light for what his eyes could not easily find. He found it. A hairline crack at the seam no wider than the edge of a coin, invisible from below. In a hard wind, that crack would draw badly. Cold air pulling in, heat pulling out a stove, working against the man depending on it. In a blizzard, a faulty draw like that could mean the difference between a warm shack and a dangerous one at the worst possible time. He packed it with the stove sealant he had brought. He had packed it because Gideon's supply list had included it, and he had followed the list, and following the list had turned out to matter more than he had known when he packed it. He sat back down and looked at the 4 words again. Bess Harmon had put that paper in his coat. Not Gideon. Gideon would have said it directly, no note required. Bess had folded it small and tucked it inside the contract at some point before he rode out, which meant she had thought about what might go wrong before he left and had given him a warning in the smallest possible package because she did not use more words than a thing required. She had thought about what might go wrong. She had thought about him. He folded the note and put it in the front pocket closest to his chest. Then he fed the stove and went to sleep because he had work in the morning. He always had work in the morning. November arrived in the Wind River high country, not as a transition, but as a commitment. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 4 days. The upper pasture, which had been difficult, became something else terrain that had stopped being neutral and started being actively opposed to the things a man needed to do in it. Rye moved the cattle down from the upper sections before the north-facing slopes became impassable. It took 4 days of hard riding in conditions that had no interest in whether he was comfortable or cold or capable, and his horse a dun gelding named Drum, whom he had worked with for 3 years and trusted more than he trusted. Most people worked without complaint through all of it. Drum had a quality Rye had recognized years before, a steadiness under pressure, a willingness to keep going when weather made other horses unreliable. Up here in November, that quality was not a convenience. It was a condition of survival. On the 3rd day of the cattle move, the North Gully flooded. Snowmelt off the high ridge came down fast and cold, turning the crossing into something that would require the extra rope and patience and the kind of physical commitment that leaves a man tired down to the level of his bones. Rye went into the water thigh-deep at the worst point, water so cold it stopped his thinking for approximately 4 seconds, long enough to understand what it would mean to stay in it longer than necessary. He got the cattle across, all of them. He came back to the line shack and stripped out of his wet clothes in the cold air and changed and fed the stove until the shack was warm enough to stop the shaking, and ate his supper standing because sitting felt like a concession he was not willing to make. Then he took out his journal and wrote his first entry. Date, weather, cattle count, fence status on the sections he had covered, the gully crossing, what he had done, what had worked, what he would do differently next time. He wrote it in plain language without conclusion. Only observation, because observation was honest and conclusion was interpretation, and he did not yet have enough of the former to trust the latter. He wrote in that journal every night for the rest of November. In the 2nd week of November, back at Harmon Ranch, Conrad Ellery arrived on a Saturday. Bess saw him coming from the barn where she was working the account ledgers at the bench near the east stall where the afternoon light was better than anywhere in the house. She heard hooves on the frozen ground and looked up and recognized the horse before she recognized the rider. She stayed exactly where she was. Conrad came through the yard with the easy confidence of a man who had never seriously questioned whether he was welcome anywhere in this county. He dismounted with a pleasant smile. "Miss Harmon, your father home?" "He's at the south section until evening," Bess said. She did not stand, did not close the ledger, gave him the attention she gave any interruption enough to be civil, no more. "I'll tell him you called." "I don't mind waiting," Conrad said. He leaned against the barn post with the ease of a man who had practiced being charming and found it worked more reliably than most tools. "Cold ride back to town. I wouldn't mind a cup of coffee and some conversation." Bess set down her pencil. "Mr. Ellery," she said, her voice pleasant and completely without give. "What is it you'd like to say to my father?" He smiled wider. "I've been thinking about the Harmon property. The north sections especially. My operation could use the grazing rights, and I imagine your father could use the income. It's a practical arrangement." "My father doesn't find that arrangement practical," Bess said. He said so twice. Men change their minds. My father doesn't. Conrad looked at her with something still friendly on the surface, but recalibrating underneath a man deciding to change approaches. You know, he said more quietly. I've been thinking about more than just the land. Bess picked up her pencil. Mr. Ellery, I have accounts to finish before evening. I'll tell my father you stopped by. Conrad straightened. The pleasantness held, but his eyes went still in the way of a man not accustomed to a conversation ending before he was ready. You've got a man wintering on Devil's Bench, he said. Bess said nothing. Calloway, Conrad said. From Kellerman's. Nothing to his name. He paused, giving the information room to settle. Devil's Bench doesn't treat men kindly in a winter like this one. Your father knows that. That's why he sent him there. Bess looked up from her ledger and gave Conrad Ellery the full, direct, unblinking attention she usually kept carefully rationed. What exactly, she said, is your point, Mr. Ellery? My point, Conrad said, is that a practical woman plans accordingly. The barn was completely quiet. Goodbye, Mr. Ellery, Bess said and looked back at her accounts. He left. Bess sat still for a moment after the sound of his horse faded. Her pencil was in her hand, but she was not writing. Then she opened the ledger to the correct page and returned to the accounts with the focused attention she gave every task, and if her jaw was set in a way it had not been when Conrad arrived, there was no one in the barn to see it. That evening she told her father everything, precise, complete in the order it had happened. Gideon listened without interruption, stirring his coffee with the slow patience of a man processing information that has consequences. He mentioned Calloway, Gideon said. He did. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Devil's Bench is hard, he said, not an apology. A fact. I know it, Bess said. Gideon looked at his daughter. At the careful steadiness of her face, the way she held herself when she was carrying something she had decided not to put down. You gave him that note, he said. The stovepipe. Bess met her father's eyes. You knew about the crack? I put it there, Gideon said. She stared at him. You, not to hurt him, Gideon said immediately, his voice quieter. To see if he'd pay attention. Most men, even good ones, they go into a place like Devil's Bench and they work the cattle, and they don't look at the things that aren't their immediate problem. A man who only fixes what's already broken isn't the same as a man who finds the problem before it becomes one. He paused. I needed to know which kind he was. You could have simply told him about the crack, Bess said. Then it would have been instructions, Gideon said, not a test. Bess sat back in her chair and looked at her father with the expression she reserved for moments when she recognized without pleasure that he was probably right. Did he fix it? She asked. He fixed it, Gideon said. He picked up his coffee cup and said nothing further. But something in his posture had changed a degree of ease that had not been there before, the settling of a man who has received an answer he was hoping for without having admitted he was hoping. Bess noticed it. She noticed everything about her father. She did not say anything about it. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark, and thought about a line shack 22 miles north and a cracked stovepipe that had been found and fixed by a man who had no obligation to find it in the dark, alone with no one watching and no one who would have known the difference. She had given him that note because it was practical, because a man should not go into Devil's Bench with a faulty stovepipe. She had done it because it was practical and for no other reason. She did not repeat this to herself a second time because saying a thing twice meant you were not certain of it the first time, and Bess Harmon had too much respect for honesty to lie to herself in the dark. December came and the real cold arrived with it, up on Devil's Bench. Cold was not a condition. It was a presence, something that moved into the line shack and the pasture and the space between a man's coat and his skin and stayed there with the patient permanence of a thing that had been doing this a very long time and had no intention of stopping on anyone's account. Rye stopped counting days in December. Counting days was the wrong way to manage a long stretch of solitary work. It made time stretch into something a man's mind would eventually refuse to carry. Instead, he counted tasks, Fence check, cattle count, water source, wood supply, stove check, journal entry, sleep. Start again. It was in the third week of December, while checking the eastern boundary, the long line that ran along the ridge and caught the full force of the northern wind, that he found the first one. A section of 12 feet. 2 posts pulled cleanly out of the frozen ground. Wire snapped in 2 places at points that corresponded with where the posts had been removed. Rye crouched and looked at the ground around the base of the nearest post. The earth had been disturbed. Not by frost heave. He had seen enough frost heave to know its signature, the way frozen ground pushed things upward with gradual, indiscriminate force. This disturbance came from the side. The soil at the base of the post had not yet frozen solid in the disturbed area, which meant someone had been here within the last 2 or 3 days. He stood and looked out beyond the boundary line at the open country on the other side. Then he looked back at the gap and at the Harmon cattle beginning to drift toward it with the interested patience of animals that understood when a barrier had been removed. He counted them back from the gap and went to work. Rebuilding fence and frozen ground at elevation in December was 4 hours of work that had no pleasant aspect. Breaking the frozen earth for each post was its own separate battle. Setting the post, tamping it solid enough to hold wire tension, moving to the next, his hands going numb after the first hour, in a way that was not reassuring, but was at least efficient. He finished as the light was going flat and gray. He stood back and looked at the line solid, tight, properly set, and felt the particular satisfaction that lives on the other side of difficult work done correctly, when every condition had conspired to make doing it poorly more appealing. Then he opened his journal and wrote the entry. Date. Location is to boundary section running north from the ridge marker. Nature of the damaged posts pulled, not broken wire, snapped at post points. Assessment of soil disturbance inconsistent with frost heave, consistent with deliberate extraction within the previous 72 hours. He wrote it in plain, careful language. He drew no conclusions. He stated only what he had observed, because observation was honest and conclusion was interpretation, and he did not yet have enough data points to earn a conclusion. He dated the entry, closed the journal, went back to work. At Harmon Ranch, a letter arrived from the county land registrar's office in Granger. Gideon read it at the kitchen table while Bess cleared the breakfast things, and the quality of his silence told her something was wrong before he said a word. Conrad Ellery had filed a formal inquiry with the county land office. Not a claim, but a recorded notation questioning the scope of the grazing rights attached to the Harmon North Section deed. Not a lawsuit, not yet. Just a question placed carefully in a public record where questions had a way of accumulating weight over time, regardless of whether they deserved it. Bess read the letter twice. He's not challenging the rights directly, she said. He's creating a record. A record creates doubt, and doubt makes other parties hesitant to do business, and a man with hesitant business partners has less leverage in every other transaction he conducts. He thinks Calloway isn't coming back, Gideon said quietly. The kitchen was very still. Is he? Bess asked. She kept her voice the way she kept everything when it mattered, level-controlled, directed only at the necessary question. Gideon looked at his daughter. At the careful steadiness of her face, the way she held the question like something she was determined not to drop. I think he is, Gideon said. Bess nodded once, turned back to the breakfast things. Then we answer the inquiry through the county attorney, she said. I'll ride to town Monday. I'll go with you, Gideon said. I can manage it, Bess said. Gideon looked at her back. His daughter at the wash basin managing things with the competence she had been building since she was 11 years old. I know you can, he said quietly. I'll come anyway. In the end, Bess rode alone because Gideon's south pasture water line chose that Monday morning to fail at the main valve, and a failing water line in December could not wait for county attorneys. Bess met with Elias Marsh, the county attorney, a careful man who had handled property law in this county for 19 years. She presented the deed language, the registered boundary descriptions, the chain of title she had reviewed 2 years earlier when she had done a full title review of the property because she believed in knowing exactly what she owned. Marsh confirmed what she already knew. The grazing rights were unambiguous. They were in the deed. They were not separable from the land under any reading of the territorial code. Bess rode home in the cold afternoon with that confirmation in writing, and a settled certainty that Conrad Ellery had known it before he filed the inquiry and had filed it anyway, which meant the inquiry was not the point. The inquiry was a beginning. Something else was the point. She did not yet know what the something else was. January. The second incident came on a morning when the temperature was low enough to make bare metal painful to touch. Same eastern boundary. Same method posts pulled, not broken. Different location 50 yards north of the first. The soil disturbance at the base consistent with the December incident. The work recent within 4 days based on the freeze depth of the disturbed earth. Rye rebuilt it. 4 hours. Journal entry. Date, location, method, observation. No conclusion. The third incident came in the last week of January. Same boundary, same method. 30 yards south of the first incident, which meant whoever was doing this was working the entire eastern section, not targeting a single weak point. A pattern required at least 3 data points to confirm itself as a pattern rather than coincidence. He now had 3. He wrote in his journal, pattern forming. Reserve judgment. Document everything. February, the worst month. Not because of the blizzard, though the blizzard came 3 days of wind that made the line, shack walls flex and moan, and turned the pasture into a single undifferentiated white without edges or horizon. Not because of the cold that followed, though the cold after the blizzard was 15 degrees lower than the cold before it. The worst month because of the heifer. She had drifted in the first hours of the storm before Rye could get the whole herd bunched at the south fence line where the terrain gave shelter. He had moved the herd 2 days before the storm arrived, based on watching the sky and the way the wind was shifting at the ridge. His reading had been right, but one heifer had already started north before he noticed, and by the time the storm hit properly, there was no going after her. He went on the third day when the wind had dropped enough that visibility returned. He found her in the northwest gully down and unable to rise. He had gone out too early, conditions were still extreme, and when he reached her, she had been down too long. He sat beside her for a while in the cold. Then he did what needed to be done and went back to the shack. That night he opened his journal and wrote the entry he had been putting off. February 14th. Lost 1 heifer, northwest gully. Blizzard, day 3. Wrong call on timing went out in conditions that were not survivable for the animal by the time I reached her. Should have waited 1 more day. I would make a different call now. 211 remaining, all in acceptable condition. He read the entry back once. Changed nothing. Closed the journal. The loss of 1 animal out of 212 was not a catastrophe by any honest accounting. Gideon Harmon had managed this section for years and had lost cattle every winter, but the mathematics were not the point. The point was that he had made a judgment call, and the judgment call had been wrong, and he was going to say so plainly when he laid this journal on Gideon Harmon's kitchen table in the spring. Because a man who softened his errors in favorable language was not the kind of man who deserved to be trusted with something that mattered. And this mattered. He fed the stove. He went to sleep. The 4th incident came on the 6th of March. Same eastern boundary, same method. This time the section was 40 yards long, the largest yet, and the soil disturbance had a different quality. Someone had been more aggressive or more careless or running out of patience. The disturbed earth around the base of each pulled post showed the kind of marks that frost heave did not make. Rye stood at the broken line and looked at it for a long time. 4 incidents, all eastern boundary, all the same method. All timed to periods of severe weather when a man managing 212 cattle across 22 miles of high pasture would be at his most stretched, his attention divided across the most demands. Someone had studied the conditions of Devil's Bench. Someone had thought carefully about when a man's back would most likely be turned. He rebuilt it. 5 hours this time, the longer section and the ground at its worst in early March. He drove each post with the focused attention of a man who understood he was doing something that would need to hold against forces that intended to test it again. When he was done, he sat on the ridge with his journal and looked out over the Harmon land. The 211 cattle moving slowly in the late afternoon light. The fence lines he had walked and repaired all winter. The water sources he had broken ice on every morning for 5 months. He thought about Conrad Ellery's eyes resting on the northeast corner of the survey map in October. He thought about a recorded inquiry filed in December. He thought about 4 sections of fence pulled on the eastern boundary all winter, in a pattern too consistent for accident and too deliberate for coincidence. He opened his journal to the 4th incident entry and wrote one additional line. Pattern confirmed. Deliberate. The eastern boundary is the target. Document everything. Then he closed the journal and sat for a while longer in the cold, clear air of early March, looking at the land he had spent 6 months keeping. March in the wind. River. High country was still winter by any honest measure. But the light was changing. The days were lengthening by minutes at first, then by amounts a man could notice without counting. The snow was pulling back from the south-facing slopes. The creek beds beneath the ice were beginning to move again, a sound Rye had not heard since October. The cattle felt it. He could see it in the way they were beginning to spread across the pasture, more alert. Less bunched, the slow recognition of animals that had endured before and knew what the changing light promised. He thought about Bess Harmon standing on the porch in October with her hair loose and the cold morning around her, and 2 words that had cost her something to say. He thought about 4 words on a piece of paper that he had carried in the pocket closest to his chest for 5 months, the paper going soft at the folds from handling. He was going back. He was going to lay the journal on Gideon Harmon's table and stand behind every word written in it, the good ones and the hard one about the heifer both. And then he was going to ask plainly and for the last time for what he had come for in September. Spring was not here yet, but it was no longer far, and Rye Calloway had not come this far through all of this to stop when the hardest part was behind him and the thing he had been working toward was finally within reach. Spring came to Devil's Bench the way honest things come, without announcement, without asking anyone's permission to arrive. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first. Then the creek beds began to move again beneath their ice water, finding its way through the places where winter had tried to stop it. Then the ice itself gave way in pieces, not all at once, but gradually, the way strong things fail when they finally fail. The cattle felt it before Rye could name it. He could see it in the way they moved, more deliberate, more spread, the quiet resumption of animals returning to the full business of being alive without making a performance of it. Rye spent the first week of April doing the final accounting. Cattle count, fence condition on every boundary section, water source status at each of the 7 locations he had monitored all winter, line shack inventory. Everything documented in the journal that had started as a practical record and had become over the months something else, a map of a winter and of the man who had moved through it. He read it back on the last evening at Devil's Bench, sitting by the stove with the door open because the air outside had finally crossed the threshold from cold into merely cool. He read every entry, changed nothing, the careful ones and the difficult one about the heifer both. The 4 fence incidents on the eastern boundary, each with its date and location and description and assessment. The line written on the 6th of March pattern confirmed. Deliberate. The eastern boundary is the target. Document everything. He closed the journal. He saddled Drum on a Tuesday morning when the sky was clear and the air had the particular freshness of early Wyoming spring, still cool, but carrying within it the suggestion of green, of growth, of things returning that had seemed in February like they might not. He did not hurry. He let Drum set the pace and the horse moved south with the purposeful ease of an animal that knew it was going home. 22 miles. Rye thought about what he was going to say for most of them and arrived at Harmon Ranch with nothing prepared, which was probably right. Gideon was in the yard, not waiting, working. Repairing a section of gate hardware that had rusted through the winter, crouched in the dirt with a wrench and a replacement bracket and the focused attention of a man who does not allow small problems the leisure to become large ones. He looked up when he heard Drum's hooves on the ground. He looked at Rye for a long moment, at his face, which was leaner than it had been in October, the winter having taken whatever softness remained in it and left behind something that was specifically the result of 6 months of hard and solitary work. At the packed saddlebags. At Drum, who was trail-worn but sound. Gideon stood. "Calloway," he said. "Mr. Harmon." Rye dismounted and tied Drum at the post and reached into his saddlebag and took out the journal. He held it out. "Cattle count at 211, he said. "Lost 1 heifer in the February blizzard. Found her in the northwest gully on the 3rd day she'd been down too long. The rest are in good condition. Fencing is intact. Line shack is sound." He paused. "The journal has the full accounting, including 4 fence incidents on the eastern boundary that I need to talk to you about." Gideon took the journal, did not open it, looked at Rye. "Come inside," he said. The kitchen table was the same as Rye remembered it. Plain, solid, everything clean and useful, and nothing decorative for its own sake. Gideon sat and opened the journal and read it the way he read everything, slowly, completely without expression. Rye sat across from him and waited. He heard movement in the back of the house, the particular sound of someone who had stopped moving in order to listen. Gideon turned to the fence incident pages, read each entry, read them again. His jaw worked in the deliberate way it did when he was processing something with consequences. He closed the journal. 4 incidents, he said. "Yes, sir. Same section of eastern boundary each time. Same method posts pulled, not broken. The ground disturbance at the base was consistent across all 4. Not frost heave." "You're saying someone pulled them deliberately." "I'm saying the evidence is consistent with that. I'm not saying I saw it happen." Rye met Gideon's eyes. "What you do with it is your call." Gideon sat back. The fire in the hearth had burned to coals, not dead, but low, needing attention that neither man was giving it. "Conrad Ellery filed a formal legal notice 3 weeks ago," Gideon said. "Not an inquiry this time. A boundary dispute claim, 40 acres on the northeast corner of the eastern section." He watched Rye's face. "The same section of boundary you were repairing all winter." Rye was quiet for a moment. "He pulled the fence to create physical evidence of a disputed boundary," he said. "Pull it often enough, leave the posts disturbed often enough, and suddenly there's a question about where the line actually sits. The inquiry in December was a distraction. This is what he was building toward from the beginning." Gideon picked up the journal again, turned it over in his hands. "The way a man handles something that has settled into a different category than it started in. 211 out of 212, he said. "Worst winter Devil's bench has had in a decade, with someone actively working against you on that eastern line." He paused. "That's not failure, Calloway." "No, sir," Rye said, "but it's not perfect either, and you deserve to know the difference." Something moved in Gideon Harmon's face. Not warmth, exactly, but what lives just before warmth in the territory. A man crosses on his way to fully trusting someone. The back door opened, and Bess came in. She stopped when she saw Rye. She had known he was here, had heard the voices, had stopped moving to listen. Now she stood in the doorway with her coat half on, and her dark hair pulled back, and her face composed in the way Rye had learned to recognize, the way that was different from her actually easy face, and required a kind of sustained effort she would never admit to. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Miss Harmon." He stood because she had come into the room. She looked at him, the full, direct, measuring look she usually kept rationed, and what she saw made something in her own face shift by a degree that only someone paying very close attention would have noticed. "You look like you wintered at Devil's Bench," she said. "Yes, ma'am, that's about right." She came to the table and sat down, not at the end, but at the side between the 2 men, the place she occupied in this family and in this house. 211, she said. "Your father told you." "I heard," she said. She looked at him steadily. "The heifer in the northwest gully." "Wrong call on timing," Rye said. "I went out too early. It's documented." Bess held his gaze. You went out in a blizzard for her and waited too long to turn back. That's not poor judgment, she said quietly. That's the wrong outcome from the right instinct. Rye said nothing to that. It felt like something he did not want to handle carelessly. Gideon set the journal on the table and put both hands flat beside it. Sit down, he said. Both of you. Let's talk about what comes next. What came next took 40 minutes at the kitchen table and was the plainest conversation Rye had been part of since Gideon had offered him Devil's Bench in October. The boundary dispute notice required a formal response within 30 days. The Territorial Archive, where the original 1851 land survey and deed records were held, was 3 days hard riding to the capital. That left at most 24 days to locate and certify the necessary documents in an archive that was not organized for the convenience of people who needed things quickly. Conrad had calculated this when he chose his timing. Someone needs to go, Gideon said. I leave in the morning, Rye said. Gideon looked at him, then without preamble, I'll go with you. Bess looked at her father. Rye looked at him too. You haven't left the county in 4 years, Bess said. I know it, Gideon said. The voice of a man who had been protecting his land for 30 years and did not find it natural to hand that protection to someone else, even someone he had begun carefully, honestly to trust. This is my land. I should know how to defend it. He looked at Rye. And I would like to know how you read documents like these. If you're going to manage this land going forward, you should learn from a man who has held the deed for 22 years. It was the right thing to say. Rye nodded. We leave at dawn. Bess stood. She went to the back of the house and came back with 2 packed saddlebags, organized with the methodical thoroughness she applied to everything. Provisions for 4 days each, dry clothes. She handed Rye his bag at the kitchen door. Their hands did not touch. But it was close. The transcription of the deed language is in the front pocket, she said. I copied it from the county filing 2 years ago when I did a full title review. When you find the survey record, compare the boundary description language, directly landmarks, measurements, directional references. If they match, the ambiguity argument has no foundation. She met his eyes and pulled the full chain of title. I want to know everything Ellery might use. You prepared for this before the notice arrived? Rye said. I prepared for this when Conrad filed the inquiry in December, she said. A man who files a legal inquiry doesn't stop at an inquiry. He looked at her for a moment. I'll be back in a week, he said. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite the full thing, but closer than it had ever been on a fence line in September or a porch in October. I know you will, she said. Go to sleep, Mr. Calloway. You leave at dawn. The ride to the territorial capital took 2 days and 14 hours. Gideon rode the way he did everything, without complaint, without unnecessary conversation, with the steady endurance of a man who had crossed difficult country before and expected to cross it again. He and Rye found a rhythm by the end of the first day that required almost no words: who set the pace, who scouted the crossings, when to push and when to rest the horses. It was the rhythm of 2 people who understood work the same way. On the second evening, camped alongside a creek running high with snowmelt, with a fire between them and the horses picketed close, Gideon said something Rye had not expected. Her mother was afraid of this land. Rye looked up from the fire. Eleanor, Gideon said. My wife. She loved the ranch. She was good at the work, willing and capable, never complained about it. But the land itself, the scale of it, the winters, the way it takes things without asking. She was afraid of it. A pause. She didn't show it. She was like Bess in that way. But I knew. Rye said nothing because nothing was what the moment required. Bess isn't afraid of it, Gideon said. Never has been. She was 11 years old when Eleanor passed, and the morning after she walked out to the south pasture and checked the water troughs because they needed checking. He paused. I was sitting in the house. That's who she is, Rye said quietly. Yes, Gideon said. That's who she is. He looked at the fire for a moment. Most men who come around, and there have been some more than she thinks, fewer than she knows, they see a large woman who works like a ranch hand, and they calculate whether the land makes up for it, whether the family name is worth the inconvenience. He said it without anger, the flat, factual tone of a man stating a wound he has long since stopped being surprised by. You didn't calculate? No, sir. Why not? It was not really a question designed to test, just to understand. Because there was nothing to calculate, Rye said. She fixed her side of that fence the same day I fixed mine. She did it well, and she didn't want thanks for it. She thought before she spoke. She laughed once one time and looked surprised at herself for it. He stopped. I've known people who work hard because they have to. She works hard because she believes things should be done right. That's different. That's everything, actually. Gideon was quiet for a long time. Good, he said finally. He went to sleep. Rye sat by the fire a while longer and thought about what it meant that Gideon Harmon had told him that story. Not the information in it, but the telling itself, the trust carried in the act of telling. He thought, I am going to take care of this man's daughter for the rest of my life. And I am going to take care of this man too, because he has been carrying this alone for a long time, and that ends now. He fed the fire and went to sleep. The Territorial Archive occupied a low building adjacent to the land office in the capital, staffed by a clerk named Aldous Fitch, who had developed a slightly defeated relationship with his own filing system after years of being surrounded by more paper than any person should reasonably be responsible for. Gideon explained what they needed. Fitch looked at his archive, 3 rooms. 4 decades of accumulated territorial documents with the expression of a man being asked to locate a specific stone in a riverbed. Territorial surveys from 1851, Fitch said. Original filing period. Harmon Land Grant, Gideon said. North Section Boundary Survey. I'll need the original grant number. Bess had included it. Of course she had. Gideon handed Fitch the deed transcription. Fitch looked at the grant number and disappeared into the back room. They waited. 40 minutes passed. Rye sat in the waiting area with the deed transcription in his hands and read the boundary description language for the 4th time, committing the specific phrases to memory, the landmarks, the measurements, the directional references. Because when Fitch returned, he wanted to be able to compare documents without having to look back and forth repeatedly. Fitch returned carrying a flat wooden box, the kind used for documents too fragile to roll or fold, and set it on the counter with the careful deliberateness of a man handling something irreplaceable. 1851 survey, he said. Original field notes and registered boundary description. Gideon opened the box. The documents inside were old, brittle at the edges. The ink faded to brown, the paper the color of old bone, but legible. The surveyor's handwriting was careful and precise. The penmanship of a man who understood his work would matter to people he would never meet. Rye spread Bess's deed transcription on the counter beside the survey documents. He read both simultaneously, the survey field notes against the deed boundary description, cross-checking every landmark, every measurement, every directional reference. The creek bend, consistent. The ridge marker, consistent. The western stake position, consistent. Then the northeast corner. Read that again, Gideon said. Rye read from the deed transcription northeast corner, established at the second limestone outcrop north of the seasonal creek, bearing 47 degrees east, northeast from the ridge marker, distance 312 yards. Gideon ran his finger along the survey field notes. Found the entry, read it aloud. Northeast corner post set at second limestone formation, north of seasonal drainage, bearing 47 degrees east, northeast from primary ridge marker, 312 yards. Same measurement, same bearing, same landmark, identical in every particular. There is no ambiguity, Gideon said. There never was, Rye said. Ellery's lawyer knew it. He was counting on you not being able to prove it in 30 days. Gideon closed the survey box with care. He looked at Fitch. I need a certified copy of this survey. All pages. 2 days, Fitch said. We'll wait, Gideon said. They were in the capital for 3 days. 2 waiting for the certified copy. One additional day that Rye spent at the territorial courthouse, pulling the full chain of title on the Hamon North section, every transfer and filing since 1851 because Bess had asked him to, in the note she had tucked into his saddlebag. And because he had learned that when Bess Harmon asked a person to do something, there was always a reason that rewarded the doing of it. What he found on the second day stopped him. The Ellery Family Trust, established by Harlan Ellery in 1869, now managed by Conrad, had filed a boundary notation in that same year. Not a formal dispute, not a legal claim. A unilateral notation recorded in the county land office stating that the northeast corner of the adjacent section was subject to survey confirmation. Filed by Harlan Ellery. Never converted to a formal dispute. Never served on Gideon Harmon. Never acted upon in any form. It had sat in the record for 14 years, doing nothing until Conrad found it and understood what it could become. Rye sat with this for a long time in the courthouse reading room. He copied the notation in full, added it to the document file, and went back to the hotel where Gideon was waiting. He laid everything on the table: the certified survey copy, the full chain of title, and the 1869 notation. Gideon looked at the notation for a long time. "His father filed this," he said. "In 1869, Rye said. 14 years ago, no action taken." Harlan Ellery. Something moved across Gideon's face, the expression of a man revisiting a history he had thought was settled. "We did business together for 12 years. He was a hard man, but an honest one. I don't think he intended this to become what Conrad made it." "No, sir," Rye said, "but it doesn't change what Conrad did with it." Gideon gathered the papers into a neat stack. "We go home tomorrow," he said. "Bess needs to see all of this." They rode home in 2 days and 13 hours faster on the return because they knew the road and the horses knew they were going home, and horses always move better in that direction. Bess met them in the yard. She looked at their faces, first the habit of a woman who has learned to read outcomes from expressions before anyone says a word. What she saw made her exhale slowly. "You found it," she said. "We found it," Gideon said. "And more." They went inside. Bess read everything at the kitchen table in the order Rye laid it down. Survey copy first, chain of title second, the 1869 notation last. When she finished the notation, she read it again, slower. "Harlan Ellery filed this," she said. "In 1869, Rye said. 14 years without action." She set it down. "This notation carries no legal standing. It was never converted to a formal dispute, never served, and sat in the record for 14 years without action." She looked at Rye. Conrad gave this to his lawyer, and his lawyer built a case on a foundation that won't hold. Did he know it wouldn't hold? "His lawyer knows land law," Rye said. He knew. The kitchen was completely still. Then Bess said very quietly, "He tried to take this land." Not a question. Not an indictment designed for a courtroom. Just the plain statement of what had happened, said by a woman who had grown up on this land and checked its water troughs at 11 years old, the morning after her mother died. Said by a woman who had memorized the deed language at 14 and ridden alone to the county attorney in January, and written the inquiry response herself in careful plain language, because she believed that plain language was the most powerful kind. "He tried," Gideon said. "He failed." "He failed," Bess said. She looked at Rye. Her eyes were steady and serious, carrying something different now, not harder, but fuller. "Because you documented 4 fence incidents in a journal no one asked you to keep, in a line shack 22 miles from anyone." "We stopped him," Rye said. "You knew the deed language. You went to the county attorney in January. You put the grant number in the transcription." He paused. "I just rode." "You rode in February," she said. "To Devil's Bench, when you didn't have to." "I said I would." She held his gaze for a long moment with the full weight of everything that had passed between October and now. Then Gideon stood, picked up his coffee cup, announced he was going to check the south pasture water line, and went out. Neither Rye nor Bess acknowledged it. They had both seen him do this before, and they both understood it for what it was. The door closed. Bess looked at the documents on the table. The certified survey, the chain of title, the notation that had tried to be a weapon and failed. Then she looked at Rye. He reached into his coat and set something on the table beside the documents. The note. 4 words folded small. The paper softened at the creases from 6 months of handling. The stovepipe. Check it. She looked at it. Then she picked it up and held it, turning it once in her hands, with the same careful attention she gave everything that mattered. "I carried that all winter," Rye said. "I want you to know that." Bess held the note for a moment longer. When she looked up, the corner of her mouth had arrived at something that was no longer the architecture of a smile, but the thing itself, quiet, real, and entirely her own. "You're a stubborn man," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Bess," she said. He looked at her. "Bess Harmon," he said. "I am asking you plainly to marry me. I have 211 cattle, a documented journal, a certified survey copy, and approximately $22 in my pocket, which is better than 14, but still not impressive. What I also have is the intention to be here for the rest of my life, working this land and taking care of this family. And I will not stop saying so until you tell me yes." Bess Harmon looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the folded note and put it in her own coat pocket. "Yes," she said. One word. No qualifier, no condition, no careful hedge. Said in the same voice she used for everything that was true, level, certain, and without apology. Rye exhaled slowly. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. Outside, somewhere on the south pasture, a man who had been walking a fence line considerably longer than any fence line in that pasture required, turned toward home at an unhurried pace, the pace of someone who had stopped pretending he was checking anything and was simply waiting for the right moment to walk back through his own kitchen door. The confrontation with Conrad Ellery came 4 days later. Conrad arrived at Harmon Ranch on a Thursday morning with his lawyer, a man named Waverly from the territorial capital who carried a leather satchel and had the quality of a man who charged by the hour and intended to earn his rate. Bess saw them from the barn. She stood still for exactly 3 seconds. Then she went inside. "Rye, Conrad Ellery is here. He brought a lawyer." Rye looked up from the table where he had been reviewing the fence documentation with Gideon. Gideon stood. His face went to the expression it used for things requiring his full attention, which was no expression at all. "Stay inside," Gideon said. "No," Bess said. Her father looked at her. "He came to this ranch," she said. "This is my home. I'm not sitting inside while decisions get made on my porch." A beat of silence. "Then come," Gideon said. The 3 of them went out together. Conrad stood in the yard with his lawyer and his easy smile assessing the 3 of them on the porch steps with the calculating look of a man measuring his audience. "Harmon," he said pleasantly. Then, "Calloway." The pleasantness diminished slightly when it reached Rye. "Didn't know you were back." "As of last week," Rye said. "Surprised," Conrad said. "Devil's bench is hard in a winter like this one." "Any winter," Rye agreed. "I managed." Conrad's smile held. He turned to Gideon. "I came to have a serious conversation about the north section and the boundary question. Mr. Waverly has reviewed the county records and the deed language and found some ambiguities worth discussing." "There are no ambiguities," Gideon said. Waverly stepped forward with the practiced smoothness of a man who had been paid to make things complicated sound reasonable. "The language in the original deed refers to boundary markers as established at the time of the original territorial filing. The question of whether a survey confirmation might be warranted given the length of time since that filing and the documentation of boundary disturbances in the intervening period. The 1851 survey is on file in certified form," Bess said. "We retrieved it from the Territorial Archive last week. Every boundary marker, every measurement, every directional reference matches the deed language exactly." She held Waverly's gaze with the full attention she usually kept rationed. "You're welcome to review the certified copy. The county attorney already has one." Waverly paused. "There is also the matter of the 1869 notation filed by your father." Rye said to Conrad, his voice even. We pulled the full chain of title. That notation was never converted to a formal dispute, never served, and was never acted upon in 14 years. Under territorial code, it carries no legal standing. He met Conrad's eyes. Your lawyer knows that. He knew it before he drafted the boundary claim. The yard was very quiet. You pulled the fence posts, Bess said. Not a question, not an accusation for a courtroom, just the statement of what she knew said in the tone of a woman who had decided that some things deserved to be said plainly, regardless of whether they could be proven to a judge. 4 times. Eastern boundary, same section. You were creating physical evidence of a disputed line so the boundary claim would have something to point to. She looked at Conrad directly. You were counting on him not coming back from Devil's Bench. The yard remained completely quiet. Conrad Ellery looked at Rye for a long moment, then at Bess, then back at Rye. And in that look was the full unpleasant acknowledgement of a man who had played a careful hand and lost it to people he had underestimated at every stage. I underestimated you, Calloway, he said. Most people do, Rye said. It usually works out for me. Conrad looked at Waverley. Some silent calculation passed between them. Then Conrad touched his hat, turned, mounted his horse, and rode out of the yard without looking back. Waverley followed a half-step behind. The yard was silent for a moment after the sound of their horses faded. Then Gideon Harmon said to no one in particular, I'll put a pot of coffee on, and went inside. Rye and Bess stood on the porch alone in the spring air with the sounds of Gideon working in the kitchen behind them and 6 months of everything that had been built sitting between them in a way that did not need to be spoken to be present. You handled that, Rye said. We handled it, Bess said. She was quiet for a moment, looking out over the yard. The deed language. I've known it since I was 14. My father made me memorize it. Good man, Rye said. He has his moments, she said. Rye looked at her. The spring light was running long and low across the yard the way it runs in Wyoming in May, when the days have finally stretched back into something generous. I have the journal, he said. 4 fence incidents documented, enough to make a case to the county sheriff if you decide that's the right move. We'll decide that together, Bess said. And she said we without apparently noticing she had said it, which told Rye everything about where they had arrived. The following week, Rye rode to the sheriff's office in Granger and sat across from a man named Cal Briggs, who had held the position for 11 years, and approached his work with the methodical patience of someone who had learned that most problems either resolved themselves or revealed their full shape if you waited long enough. Rye laid the journal on Briggs's desk and talked for 20 minutes without embellishment. Only facts. Only the order in which they had happened. Briggs read the journal entries twice. 4 incidents, he said. Same boundary section, same method. Documented, Rye said. What you do with it is your job. Briggs almost smiled. Fair answer. He looked at the journal for another moment. I'll ride out to the east boundary next week and have a look at the post sites. If the ground disturbance is what you documented, I'll have a conversation with Conrad Ellery. That's all I'm asking, Rye said. Briggs rode out the following Thursday. He found what the journal described. He had a conversation with Conrad Ellery that, by all accounts, from the people who heard about it afterward, was thorough quiet, and not one Conrad Ellery was likely to forget soon. Conrad Ellery withdrew his boundary claim 10 days later. No comment, no apology, which was its own kind of answer. The county attorney's formal response to Waverley's notice went out the week after Rye's visit to Briggs. Elias Marsh had drafted it with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been waiting to write it since January, when Bess had first come to his office with the deed language, and the quiet certainty of someone who already knew what the facts were and simply needed the legal structure to catch up. The response included the certified survey, the chain of title, and a citation of the relevant territorial code on inert notations. It also included, at Marsh's personal initiative, a letter to the Territorial Bar Association regarding the ethical obligations of attorneys who file claims on foundations they know to be unsound. Marsh told Bess about the Bar Association letter when she came to review the final documents. She said nothing. She simply picked up her copy of the response and put it in her bag and thanked him for his time. On the ride home, she was quiet for most of a mile. Then she said, "He used his father's mistake to try to take what wasn't his." "Yes," Rye said. "His father may not have meant it as a weapon." "Probably not," Rye said. "But Conrad did." Bess rode for another quarter-mile. "My father will take time with that," she said, realizing a long friendship carried something hidden. "He will," Rye agreed. "I'll take less time," she said. "I didn't have the friendship. I only have the result." She looked ahead at the road. "Some things are easier to let go of when you are never holding them." Rye looked at her, riding beside him in the spring light, and thought about the fence line in September and the water trough in October, and 3 refusals that had been each one of them a different kind of door opening rather than closing, and understood that he was looking at a woman who had been waiting a long time for someone who would not make her do the work of both of them. He had done his half. She had always been prepared to do hers. The wedding was on a Saturday in late May. Not large. Bess had not wanted large, and Gideon had accepted this with the particular relief of a man who had been prepared to organize something bigger, and found the smaller version easier in every way that mattered. The minister came from the next town over, a man named Hargrove, who had married enough people to understand that the ceremony itself was not the point, and his job was to get out of the way of the 2 people in it as efficiently as possible. The witnesses were Gideon, a neighbor woman named Clara Hobbs, who had known Bess since childhood and cried quietly and without apology through the entire proceedings, and Sheriff Briggs, who stood with his hat in both hands and the same patient, thorough expression he wore for everything. They stood in the front room of Harmon Ranch beside the hearth and said the words. When it was done, Hargrove shook Rye's hand and said, "Good luck to you both," with the genuine warmth of a man who meant it. Bess looked at Rye with the expression that had started as no expression at all on a fence line in September, and had traveled through 3 refusals and 1 winter and a 4-word note and a certified land survey to arrive at this. Steady, warm, entirely her own. "Well," she said. "Well," Rye said. Clara Hobbs cried harder. Gideon shook Rye's hand. He held it longer than a handshake required, the grip of a man putting something real into the gesture because he did not have another way to put it. "Son," he said. 1 word. Rye stood in the Harmon Ranch front room with that word settling into him and thought about a gate in September and a rifle across a man's knees, and you'd better be worth more than you look, and the distance between that moment and this one and what had filled that distance. Work. Honesty. A winter that tried everything it had. A woman who said yes the way she said everything true, without apology, without condition, without needing to be asked twice. "Thank you," Rye said. "For Devil's Bench. For all of it." Gideon released his hand. "You needed it as much as I did," he said. Then he picked up his coffee and looked at the wall, which was the Gideon Harmon way of handling things that had gotten as close to the center of him as they were going to get, and did not look back. The first year of the marriage was the hardest and the best year Rye Calloway had ever lived. Hard, because building something from the ground up always is, and what they were building was not small. The north section under Rye's full management. The Devil's Bench grazing contract renewed for 5 years at Gideon's negotiation better terms than the previous arrangement, because Gideon negotiated the way he did everything, with patience and without sentiment. Additional fence line on the eastern boundary, rebuilt in cedar posts that would not pull easily, with a legal covenant filed at the county office recording every boundary marker and its surveyed coordinates, which Bess had insisted on and Marsh had drafted, and which now sat in the county record as the most thoroughly documented property boundary in the northern district. Conrad Ellery's inquiry had in the end produced the strongest possible title documentation the Harmon land had ever held. Bess noted this with the dry satisfaction of a woman who appreciated irony in its most useful form. Best because of what it meant to come home at the end of a day's work to a woman who knew exactly what that work cost and valued it honestly, without waiting for it to be translated into terms she could understand. Bess understood it from the ground up, the same ground Rye walked every day. And when they sat at the kitchen table in the evenings, the same table where Gideon had laid a folded contract in October and changed the direction of everything, the conversation they had was the conversation of two people building the same thing from the same foundation. Gideon ate supper with them most evenings. He had offered once to take his meals separately. "You're married now, you don't need an old man at your table every night," and Bess had given him the look she used for statements that did not warrant a response and set a third place at the table, Pa. And that had been the end of that discussion. Gideon had not argued. Over the following weeks he began arriving at supper 10 minutes earlier each time, which was his version of gratitude, and required no acknowledgement. In October, exactly 1 year after Rye had ridden north to Devil's Bench in the pre-dawn cold, Bess told him something at the kitchen table after supper, after Gideon had gone to bed, and the kitchen belonged to the two of them. She told him plainly, the way she told him everything. Rye sat still for a moment. Then he put both hands flat on the table, the gesture that meant something was too large for his usual composure, and looked at her. "You're certain," he said. "I am a careful woman," she said. "I don't report things I'm not certain of." He exhaled slowly. "When?" he said. "Spring," she said. "Late April, I think." Spring. The same season he had ridden back from Devil's Bench with a journal and a certified survey and $22 in his pocket, and asked her to marry him at a kitchen table. "That's appropriate," he said. "I thought so," she said. The corner of her mouth arrived at the full smile, the real one, the one that had been waiting since the first time he had made her laugh on a fence line in September, the one she had stopped trying to put away. "You're going to have to tell my father," she said. Rye looked at her. "You're not going to tell him. He'll want to hear it from you," she said. "Trust me." "Why?" "Because," she said, "you are the man who came back from Devil's Bench, and you are the man who documented 4 fence posts in a journal nobody asked for. And you are the man who rode 3 days to a territorial archive and found a survey record in a disorganized box and understood what it meant." She held his gaze with those level, direct eyes. "My father will want to hear this news from that man." Rye stood. He went to Gideon's room and knocked. Gideon opened the door in the way of a man who had not been asleep, who had been sitting up aware that something was moving in his house and waiting in the quiet way he waited for everything. He looked at Rye's face and read it the way he read everything thoroughly accurately, without needing it explained. Something moved across Gideon Harmon's face that Rye had never seen there before. Not the almost smile from October. Not the measured respect of a man deciding whether to trust. Something older and quieter, the expression of a man arriving at a place he had been walking toward for a long time without knowing whether he would reach it. "Spring," Gideon said. "Late April," Rye said. "She thinks." "She's careful," Gideon said. "She doesn't report things she's not certain of." "No," Rye said. "She never has been." Gideon made a sound that might from a generous angle have been a laugh, short, low, involuntary. He pressed his lips together after it the same way Bess did. Then he put his hand on Rye's shoulder. Not briefly. He held it there for a moment with the weight of a man putting something real into the gesture because he did not have another language for it. "Good," Gideon said. "That's good, son." Son. One word again. Rye stood in the doorway of Gideon Harmon's room with that word settling into him alongside the one from May, and thought about a gate in September and a rifle across a man's knees, and you'd better be worth more than you look, and everything that had filled the distance between that moment and this one. "Good night, sir," Rye said. "Good night," Gideon said, and closed his door. The child was born on a Thursday in late April, exactly as Bess had thought, in the room that had been her room and was now their room, with a doctor from Granger and Clara Hobbs and Gideon pacing the front room with the patience of a man discovering that patience has limits he had not previously located. Rye was inside the room because Bess had told him he would be in the voice she used for things that were not open for discussion, and he had said yes, and meant it. It was a girl. She came into the world with Bess's dark hair and Rye's particular stubbornness, which was evident from approximately the first 30 seconds. She was large and loud and entirely herself from the beginning, which surprised no one who knew either of her parents. Bess held her and looked at her with an expression that had no precedent in Rye's experience of Bess's face. Not the composed steadiness, not the direct honesty, not even the real smile. Something underneath all of those things that had been waiting for this specific moment to surface, something that belonged only here, only now, and had no name that Rye knew. "She's perfect," Rye said. "She's going to be difficult," Bess said. "She already is." She looked up at Rye. There were tears on her face, which he had never seen before, and she made no move to address them, which meant she had decided they were acceptable. "She's going to know how to do useful things." "Yes," Rye said. "She is." "And she's going to know this land," Bess said. "Every fence line, every water source, every deed description and survey marker." "She will," he said. "And she'll know," Bess said quieter, "that the man who built this for her started with $14 and a horse and did not quit." Rye looked at his daughter in Bess's arms. He thought about a fence line in September, and a bunkhouse in the dark, and a rifle across a man's knees, and a note with 4 words, and a winter that had tried everything it had and found it was not enough. He thought about what it meant to be the kind of man who fixes a fence that is not his because it needs fixing, and what that one decision in a Wyoming September had set in motion. He put his hand over Bess's on the blanket. "She'll know," he said. "All of it." Rye went to the door and opened it. Gideon was in the hallway, not pacing now, just standing, which was its own kind of waiting for a man like Gideon Harmon. He looked at Rye's face and read it the way he read everything. Something moved across his expression. Not the almost smile from October, not the measured respect from the yard in spring. Something older and quieter than both. The expression of a man arriving at a place he had been walking toward for a long time, without being certain he would reach it. "Come in," Rye said. Gideon came in without a word. He looked at his daughter and his granddaughter, and stood at the foot of the bed with his hat in both hands, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said to Bess, "Your mother would have—" He stopped. "I know, Pa," Bess said. Gideon nodded once, looked at the child. "What's her name?" Bess looked at Rye. Rye looked at Bess. They had discussed this not at length, because neither of them did things at length when they could do them plainly. They had arrived at the answer the way they arrived at everything, by thinking it through honestly and finding they agreed. "Eleanor," Bess said. Gideon Harmon went very still. Then he sat down in the chair beside the bed. Slowly, the way a man sits when he has just set down something heavy he has been carrying for a long time, and he put his face in his hands for a moment. Just a moment. No one said anything because nothing needed to be said. When he looked up, he looked at his granddaughter with the full, clear attention of a man who has been given back something he thought was gone. "Eleanor," he said. The name of his wife. The name of the woman who had been afraid of this land and loved it anyway, who had taught her daughter that a person ought to know how to do useful things, who had been gone for 8 years and was present in this room now in every way that mattered. He looked at Rye. Not with assessment, not with the measuring look of a man deciding whether to trust. With something that lived on the other side of trust, the look of a man who has watched another man do what he said he would do consistently over time, in conditions designed to make him stop. "She'll know this land," Gideon said. "Every fence line," Bess said. "Every water source, every deed description and survey marker." "She will," Rye said. "And she'll know," Gideon said quieter, looking at Rye with something in his eyes that had no word for it in his vocabulary, which was why he had always put it in his hands instead, that her grandfather was sitting in the house when he should have been checking the water troughs, and that the man her mother married checked them instead. He paused. She should know the full story. "She will," Rye said. "All of it." Outside, the spring wind moved through the yard of Harmon Ranch. The cattle were on the south pasture. The eastern boundary fence, rebuilt in cedar posts, documented in the county record with every marker and coordinate that Bess had insisted on and Marsh had drafted, and Rye had stood behind with everything he had stood clean and tight in the afternoon light. Rye Calloway had come through that gate 8 months ago with dirt on his boots and $14 in his pocket, and nothing else that the world would have counted as anything. He had fixed a fence that was not his. He had stayed when he was told to go. He had gone where he was sent and come back when he said he would. He had documented 4 fence posts in a journal no one asked him to keep in a line shack, 22 miles from anyone who would have known the difference in a winter that tried everything it had and found it was not enough. And every mile of all of it had been worth exactly what it cost, because every mile had been in the service of something true. This was what $14 bought if the man who carried it was the right kind of man. Not the land, not the cattle, not the legal title or the certified survey or the 5-year grazing contract. This a daughter with her grandmother's name, a father-in-law who had said son twice now and meant it more the second time than a man could put into words, and a woman who had said yes at a kitchen table in April and was still saying it every day, in every way that mattered, without being asked to repeat herself because she had never needed to. This was what a man built when he started with nothing but his word and the willingness to stay. He built everything,